For those of you who don't know me, I am Patricia Jurowitz. I am the CEO of Responsible Sourcing Network. That is a new title for me because Responsible Sourcing Network is now an independent 501c3 organization and is managing the YESS initiative, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced, as Erin mentioned. I have probably over 20 years experience in supply chains focused on human rights at raw commodity level. In particular, that portion of it hasn't been the full 20 years. For some of you who know me, I was at the Gap in production, managing production for a couple of years. Quite a while ago, although I didn't know her then. My colleague Liz Muller was also at the Gap, but I'll go ahead and let Liz introduce herself quick before we get started.
Great, thank you, Patricia. So for those of you who don't know my background, as Patricia mentioned, I was the environmental manager at Gap Inc. And on behalf of Gap, I was the first chair of the Better Cotton Initiative. And that really threw me into commodity supply chains, which is my expertise and been the focus of my work for the past 15 years, primarily working in and around due diligence. I have been supporting the Responsible Minerals Initiative. For those of you who are familiar with that initiative, first overseeing one of the first 3 audit firms. And then as that program grew bigger than my business, I stepped back and have been supporting and providing advice and resources to smelters and refiners that are assessed under the minerals program. And it's my honor to be part of the Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced and bringing a lot of that experience from the RMI and the associated due diligence framework to this standard and program. So lots of background in cotton, but also due diligence. Thank you, Patricia.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm going to, I guess before I dive into YESS and give a quick overview of that, just to go over the agenda, we will be talking about the sponsorship and status of different opportunities to sponsor. My understanding is that Erin and the other associations have shared those sponsorship document with all of you, but we can let you know where our current status is. Go over in more detail what we've done, where we're going with both the pilot project as well as an implementation working group that I'll be talking about, general timeline, next steps, and as I said, leaving a lot of room for questions and discussion. And if you do want to go ahead and type any question into the chat, Liz and I will try to address it, as those questions kind of come up on something we're saying at the moment, and then have more of that discussion at the end. So just to remind you all, the YESS mission is to implement an industry-wide due diligence program to empower and ensure that spinners and mills are eliminating cotton produced with forced labor from their value chains. So when we talk about forced labor, we're really looking at first determining the locations of where it likely exists. The YESS program has done quite a bit of research. We have a methodology based on ILO indicators on our website and looking for evidence. We've come up with 9 countries where there's high risk of forced labor. With that said, this is a real general analysis. This analysis needs to have a lot more refinement to it, as well as there's really an expectation that all tiers of the supply chain are looking at where there's risk in their supply chain for forced labor. We are only looking at forced labor. Get further into, wrong direction. But knowing where your cotton originates is always a very complex issue. Liz developed this slide quite a while ago. She'll talk about the additional complications working with looking at textile mills now. But what we're really trying to untangle this whole supply web. In particular, many of you may know that traceability to country of origin is typically lost at the spinning mill where yarn from several, cotton lint from several countries could all be merged together and spun into the same yarn, and it's quite difficult to know where it goes after that. The YESS initiative is set up to really create, kind of somewhat of a gatekeeper role of all lint coming into a spinning mill. And what we're really trying to do is set up this system so all the cotton lint that is with a high risk of being produced with forced labor is kept out of the warehouse of the mill, and that what is coming in is only low risk cotton. So whether that's conventional cotton or whether that's going toward all of the various sustainable cottons that are out there, what's most important is keeping that high risk cotton out of the facility. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. I should probably use my arrows instead of my mouse. But talking about the scope of YESS, I mentioned, that we do have a focus on forced labor. I know there's a lot of human rights issues out there, but we're not going to tackle all of them right now. Forced labor is our major concern. It has a capacity and due diligence approach to training and then assessing the spinning mills as well as textile mills, that they have management systems and their own controls for understanding where cotton originates and under what conditions it's being harvested. In particular, if it's coming from one of those high-risk countries, we need to know that they're requiring additional due diligence to ensure that it's not being harvested with forced labor. It's a mass balance calculation at the facility. I mentioned the gatekeeper keeps the high-risk cotton out, but once it's within the spinning facility, then there's that ability for the spinning mill or the textile mill to be blending cotton from a variety of sources. It's a one annual assessment for the entire industry, so we're not looking to have individual brands do this assessment. Really, the way we can build efficiencies and really make this work is for the entire industry to work together and only have one assessment a year of these facilities. I mentioned it's not looking at all human rights issues. It's also not looking at the labor conditions inside the facilities. We know that there's other initiatives out there who are doing that, and we're really trying to not duplicate any other efforts. And if anything, we want to coordinate with others. We'll talk about that, but it's not a check the box or a certification. It's really an assessment of the management systems. I don't know, Liz, do you want to say anything else before I move on this slide?
No, I think that's great. I think you covered it, and just that we're not inspecting at a product level and a transaction level. So again, the management system and making sure that that's being implemented and is effective is the core of the program.
Thanks. Which does, it is modeled after the Responsible Minerals Initiative, as Liz was speaking her experience. I've also fed into that process, which is, that assessment of the smelters and the refiners. Again, also looking at management systems. So it takes a similar approach. So the sponsorship levels that we have laid out are, first of all, as the pilot sponsor, which are five companies that have all committed to supporting at that sponsorship level for being part of the pilot project. They're part of the pilot project team. Liz will be speaking more to that shortly. As well, and they get to nominate 2 spinning facilities or textile mills. There's going to be access to online trainings, in-person trainings, having the summary of findings, as well as the invitation to be part of the implementation working group and access to quarterly updates. What we still have open, and what I'd love to have you all be involved with us, are supporting at the ambassador or supporter levels. So we do give a range of what you could contribute. The lower end of that range, so the $7,500 at the ambassador level, that's the minimum amount to be part of that level. If your company is in a position to support at a higher level, then we would love to. We welcome that. You know, we're pretty scrappy. We're getting this thing off the ground, and any contribution that you could make will help. We're going to be looking more at overall revenues and how to make it sustainable. I'll be within the working group. I'll talk about that shortly. But what that ambassador level will give you are access to all the online trainings, as well as select in-person trainings per availability. One is, depending what's going on with the pandemic, being able to offer those in-person trainings. But the idea is that after all the online trainings are done, before the in-person assessments would be done with the pilot facilities, is that there'll be refresher trainings in person. And if those are in a location where there's other sourcing staff or that type of thing, and the setup is appropriate for others to join those trainings, that's when it'll be available. So there's a lot of ifs right there, hence why we put per availability, but ideally in an ideal world. And the other thing, Liz and I were just talking about it, if there's demand for more in-person trainings besides what's occurring with the pilot, that's something that we could look at. I mean, part of doing the pilot is not only to ensure that we have the standards correct for both the textile mills and any fine tuning for the standard for the spinning mill, but making sure that all the trainings, you know, we're piloting all the trainings as well. So whether they need to be tweaked, if there's, you know, something missing that the facilities will need to be able to pass these assessments, you know, we want to really set the facilities up to be successful in passing the assessments. So, you know, the capacity building and even the assessment that the companies go through, that the facilities go through, you know, is really checking to make sure that they understand the expectations, that they have the correct management systems, et cetera. We really want to support and encourage them as much as possible. And while I know, Liz, you'll get into trainings in a little bit more time, but that's available to your sourcing offices, you know, to your own staff, those online trainings. We'll be looking at how those could be opened up to more suppliers in the future. But at ambassador level, you'll also get an overall summary of all the findings from the pilot. And I think the really big part of it is being able to participate in the implementation working group. I'll go into that in more detail, but the idea and the main focus of the working group is really to work with me. You know, Liz is going to be super busy with the pilots, but looking at how to integrate YESS into the industry, right? We know that there's a lot of other initiatives out there. RSM, Responsible Sourcing Network, is a member of many of those initiatives, but we really want to take advantage of as many existing infrastructure and even auditors who are already out going to these facilities. So I'll get into that in a little bit more, but the idea of the working group is to really help drive how that all will unfold in the future. As well as at all levels, there'll be access to quarterly updates, and at that supporter level, you'll also have access to those online trainings. All right, a couple of, yes, the deck will be available after the Zoom call. Great question. So the question is, are the trainings targeting the brand or the upstream suppliers? And the trainings will target, and actually, Liz, why don't you speak to this, just because you're the one who's going to be delivering those trainings?
Sure, and I just pointed out originally, so our focus right now is to really, as Patricia mentioned, is to really do the capacity building and empowering the mills and the spinners to develop effective due diligence management systems. So the trainings will be designed to help those entities, but certainly anyone who participates will certainly learn a lot about due diligence and the standard and what's expected. So we're hoping that the sourcing teams and others that can support your mills and spinners will participate in those trainings. And I just mentioned also in the chat that we'll be, throughout this process, we'll be training auditors, but slightly different because they have a different role.
Great, thank you. The other, another question that has come in has been about the ID system, that an ID system has been set up for smelters and refiners, and is that something that we plan to do with YESS? It's needed and necessary. However, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So one of the thinkings that I have, and I know I need to, this actually the working group could focus on this, but is potentially to use the infrastructure that the Open Apparel Registry has already created. And because they're already creating IDs for all facilities and looking to offer more transparency there, in my ideal world, we could try to tap into that existing infrastructure and creating a database for YESS, well, for all spinning mills and textile mills within that, that structure. And then what we would lay on top of it would be if they're YESS approved. And actually not just YESS approved, but really talking about, you know, can we be offering various levels of capacity building for those facilities? So one, to know, to really start building this global understanding of who all the spinning mills and textile mills are in the world, at least those that are processing cotton. And then we could layer on top of it, have they attended any of the, have they gone through the webinars, right? Have they passed the exams that are affiliated with those webinars? Have they done any in-person trainings? Have they gone through an in-person assessment? And so we're looking at kind of, you know, really understanding, and we will talk a bit more about capacity building, but again, you know, really looking at efficiencies of how not to have to create something from scratch. And so if the Open Apparel Registry works for us for IDs, that's where I want to go. And I know there's other questions that are coming in. Some of them are, I don't know, Liz, if there's any in particular you want to speak to. Otherwise, we could go through this slide deck and maybe kind of bring those up. Since I think some of the slides that we have will actually speak to some of those as well.
Terrific.
Okay. Oh, get my arrow over here. There we go. Okay, so the two work streams that I mentioned will be the YESS pilot project as well as then the YESS implementation working group. And so I'm going to turn it over to Liz to actually talk about the YESS pilot project.
Great, thank you, Patricia. So many of you may be aware that we did publish the YESS standard for spinners. It was originally called for cotton, but since we're now developing a second one for the textile mills, we refer to that as the standard for spinners. That has been published, and but however, many of the brands don't know who their spinners are. So the focus of this year is to develop the YESS standard for textile mills, and then pilot either one. We know that some of the brands that are part of the pilot project team will be nominating textile mills. We don't know yet if they will be nominating spinners. So that's why we have a to be determined. But I'm pleased to announce that we do have at least a working draft of the textile standard. I'm in the process of developing a lot of the tools and resources and trainings, which is another real big focus of the YESS program. I really would love for people to understand that the capacity building and the training and the resources and helping the spinners and mills succeed is really what we want to focus on. And the assessment is to assess whether or not their system is working as planned and identify opportunities to improve those over time. So we do have 5 brands. They will be nominating, what I believe there will be 9 facilities overall, and we don't yet know what locations, the geographies for those mills and spinners. And then in parallel, I will be bringing on 2 audit firms, firms that I've worked very closely with and know the quality and care that they give. And so we will be working together, and I'll be training them in parallel as we move through this pilot program. Thanks. Patricia, did you want to go over the implementation working group?
Oh, there we go. I'm unmuted. Yes, thank you. And I had said briefly, but that in parallel to the work that Liz is going to be doing, spearheading the pilot, is that I'll be really building the overall YESS initiative, turning it into a YESS program or system where it will oversee the implementation of the YESS standards. So the idea really is not that a team from Responsible Sourcing Network is going to be doing the auditing. We want to be working with the third-party auditors. As Liz mentioned, she's going to start training them this year. RSN is the holder of the standards, so this for the spinners as well as for the textile mills, as well as really ensuring that we have integrity and credibility with those doing the audits, making sure that those audits are of very high level and high caliber, and that we can integrate this information in with other initiatives or platforms. We know that a lot of companies have different production management tools, et cetera, as well as the kind of due diligence that they're all implementing. So really figuring out how do we do this in the most cost-effective, sustainable, scalable fashion, and take advantage of already existing systems and structures, as I mentioned, for example, with OAR. So the idea of the implementation working group is to invite to be part of that a variety of stakeholders, so that we have all those who would be impacted by this approach involved with deciding how it'll be implemented into the industry, including brands, mills, spinners, industry experts, audit firms, NGOs, and the multi-stakeholder initiatives. I actually will go further into detail on that in a moment, but just wanted to give a very high level timeline as to how we're moving through this year. And originally we had this laid out 2021 and 2022. I know we have some 2022 numbers there at the end, but Liz and I were talking earlier today, and we're basically trying to probably squish 2 years worth of work into 1 year, because we know how much there's a need at the moment for brands and retailers to really have a better understanding of where their cotton originates and under what conditions was it harvested. And I think a question came in, and I will speak to this really quickly, and maybe because it came up before on the kind of this scope of YESS, what it does and doesn't do, which is about that we're not looking at the labor conditions inside the processing facilities, such as the ginning, spinning, weaving, or knitting facilities. And the reason, and so yes, another initiative or another system would have to be looking at that. The Social Labor Convergence Program, for example, I know does look at labor conditions inside facilities. So does SEDEX, so does, GOTS has something like that for the spinning mills, et cetera. So we're really leaving that up to others. At the same time, there's an opportunity maybe to cross-train auditors. So if they're in there doing an audit, doing a GOTS audit, for example, if they're also trained on how to do the YESS assessment, that they could add that on, again, an opportunity for efficiencies. So, but the YESS standard does not cover the labor conditions inside the facility. All right, so the timeline, Liz has been hard at work over the last couple of months. She actually is getting very close to having a draft standard ready for textile mills. For those of you who don't know, we did release the standard and assessment workbook back in 2019 for spinning mills. That's on our website. But we do think that it probably could be tweaked a little bit as we go through the pilot, make sure that the standard for the textile mills and the spinning mills are aligned, and make sure that they're both as kind of simple and clear as possible. We'll be starting remote trainings later this year in June because we need to develop all of those training materials. Then there's going to be remote support, both a remote kind of management system assessment, as well as support for all of the facilities that are part of the pilot. That'll happen this summer. And then ideally the on-site assessments with the auditor training at the very end of this year in Q4. Again, some of that is all going to be depending on pandemic, as well as timely with funding, and maybe now's actually a good time to announce that I know that Verite just put out its announcement today, but for those of you who are familiar with the an opportunity, a funding opportunity through the Department of Labor and iLab, Verite was rewarded one of 2 grants at the $4 million level to look at transparency and traceability efforts. In particular, they're focusing on India. And I'm happy to say that Responsible Sourcing Network is a sub-grantee of Verite, and that will be assisting with training and doing, I think, some pilot assessments in India as part of that Verite program. So, but what's also really great is that some of that funding is helping to cover the cost of development of some of the training materials that we are in the process of developing. So that's all great. With that said, we're still in need of sponsors. So I don't want to think that we don't have it, but at least we do have the funding that we need to get off the ground with all the drafting of the textile standard, as well as initiating the development of all the training materials. And then at the end of the year, or actually beginning of next year, do a public consultation of the YESS standard for the textile mills, because we haven't, we'll want to do that, after we do all our fine tuning this year. We did do that with the spinning mills, a couple of years ago, but we need to do it with the textile mills. Another way for the industry really to weigh in with our approach, so that we will be ready then to start rolling this out at a larger scale in 2022. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Liz now to go through a little bit more detail about the timeline and project plan for the pilots.
Great, thanks, Patricia. And I'm going to keep it brief. I can see we have quite a lively chat, and I think a discussion would be most helpful for our time left. So Patricia had mentioned that we are planning to do the trainings in June. I will be busy up until then developing the trainings and the resources. So again, I found that much of the success of the Responsible Minerals Initiative is helping those supply chain actors succeed. In my experience, supply chain actors are really, really, really good at doing what their buyers and their customers want. We just need to add some clarity and help them understand what is expected. Due diligence is a different mindset. And so I'm spending much of the first part of this year creating the YESS elements, whether that is the actual standard, the assessment workbook, trainings, resources, tools. And just a note, when we say the create trainings and the knowledge assessments are just kind of a quiz to reinforce key points, but also to make sure that the spinners and the mills have actually listened and absorbed the training. That's both to manage everybody's time, but also for me to be able to evaluate whether the trainings are effective. So after as Patricia mentioned, we will have a series of 5 different trainings. So we're basically going to introduce the YESS standard and then break it down in manageable chunks. So know your supplier, what is expected there? How do they conduct due diligence on the material, the cotton that they're bringing in, whether that's recycled yarn or other textiles, should they be a textile mill be supplementing their inventory. And then we will get into high risk sourcing. So if they are sourcing from high risk, what are the additional levels of due diligence that would be required? So really trying to take this as a one issue and one part of the program at a time. And so we'll be doing that in June. And with that training and with some resources and tools in hand, I will be spending more one-on-one time with the participating mills and spinners to help them. It's kind of a simultaneous, help them develop their management system and assess how effective and appropriate it is for them at that time. That will be done remotely. And then they will have some time to take my feedback and adjust their program. And as we then shift over to the logistics of preparing for on-site visits, I will spend kind of the August timeframe, August, September with the logistics, and also be training up the auditors at that point in time. Then the last part of the year, probably I'm hoping that we can be traveling in October. So October to December would really be when we're conducting those on-site assessments. And wherever we do an on-site assessment, wherever that sourcing hub is, which we don't know yet, it will be dependent upon where the participating brands, the nominated spinners and mills are located. But let's say there'll be one in Asia, then we would also want to provide in-person trainings. And the thought is to do a refresher, as we mentioned, Patricia mentioned, designed for the smelters and, spinners and mills. And then also maybe have a day in between where I could then also doing some refresher training for the auditors, as well as possibly training sourcing teams and others that will be part of the YESS family, and to help move this forward in the future. And then after we complete all the on-site assessments, and this is important, each of the participating spinners or mills will receive a full assessment workbook that we have documented all of their findings in detail. That will only be provided to them because it has proprietary information. But in the end, we will be identifying the corrective actions. We will follow up with them as appropriate. And at the end of the entire pilot, I will be summarizing kind of overview and overarching findings from our experience so that we can share that with all of our sponsors and the community at large. So the next slide. So just to differentiate a little bit between the two different standards. So as we mentioned, we've had the YESS standard for spinners. And the reason we started there is they really are the critical gatekeeper. They're the ones who break open bales of cotton lint and mix it into yarn. And with that, we lose the traceability back to the origin. So eventually, even if we are actually assessing and working with textile mills, you still need to go through the spinners to find out what the origin of the cotton lint is, since YESS is focused on forced labor at the cotton farm. So we have determined, our proposal certainly is to focus on all the, any purchases of cotton lint is really relevant and applicable with the YESS standard for spinners. Even if it is a vertical facility that has the spinning and the mill operations, we would treat those as two different facilities under the YESS program, with the spinning operations being assessed against the YESS standard for spinners, and then the textile mill being assessed under the YESS standard for textile mills. So we anticipate that about 95% of all the textile mills will be purchasing yarn and then incorporating that into their textiles or fabrics. So that will be the focus. But however, we also need to accommodate, unless it's proven otherwise, that textile mills that may at time purchase fabric from other mills. So we are accommodating that as well. Now, I mentioned that the cotton lint is subject to the spinner requirement. We do need to untangle, as Patricia mentioned, the cotton lint that's within the yarn that's being purchased by the textile mills. So we will have to allow for the textile mills to either purchase cotton yarn from a YESS approved conformant spinner, which that would give us confidence that all of the cotton in that yarn is low risk. Or if they're sourcing from a spinner, they are allowed to segregate their low risk cotton yarn from other sources in that spinning mill. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to sign up for YESS and participate in some of the trainings, because that's the level of detail that we'll get into when we are training the textile mills and the spinners. So the high risk source, this is a tweak we know we need to make to the spinner standard. Under OECD, they insist that the actual spinners are identifying the high risk origins for cotton. So Patricia has mentioned she did a fantastic job of identifying 9 countries of high risk. So that will be a minimum of what is considered high risk under YESS. But should a spinning mill also add some criteria and have additional origins, that can be reflected in that standard. But it is all really at the farm level and the country where the cotton is produced. The same philosophy will go to the textile mills, where they will have to identify their determination of what makes a yarn supplier, so the spinner, what would qualify them as a high risk. My proposal is to look at trade flows of the cotton that originates from the 9 countries of lint production and where those are typically sent, exported into, and therefore can be incorporated into the yarn. But this is one of the things that we will need both the pilot project and the implementation working group and a variety of other stakeholders to weigh in on before we suggest maybe a de minimis kind of a high risk origin for yarn. So the next slide would be back to Patricia.
Yep, and I'll try to wrap up here quickly so we can have time for a discussion and answering the rest of the questions that have come in on the chat. I mentioned, the different types of organizations and companies that we'd like to have part of the working group, not only brands, retailers, and NGOs, but also industry experts in particular, ideally from the traders and merchants industry, the audit firms, could be regional groups. I've had some brands ask me that question, regional textile mill organizations. Liz and I have reached out to ITMF, for example, to really start to engage that sector of the industry, as well as other organizations such as Better Cotton Initiative, Cotton Made in Africa, GOTS, SLCP, I mentioned all of those. Because that's where I think that there's really going to be opportunities to develop efficiencies, in particular the coordination and collaboration, so that we can have a harmonized approach going forward, because I think that's really what's going to have the most success for the industry, and not have to try to converge different approaches later on. The other aspect, just in regards to more specific focus areas, is that I think it would be best for us to develop subgroups focused on different aspects. Liz was talking about forced labor assessment, as well as having an understanding of the farm level initiatives, and do they all have appropriate criteria themselves for ensuring no forced labor is occurring at cotton production. Or what is the criteria for YESS in regards to spinners accepting that cotton? There's going to be opportunities and really important of looking at how do we scale this. A lot of brands have asked us in conversations of how it could be scaled. And I think that there are auditor management organizations out there, as well as e-learning platforms. There's going to be various opportunities such as those to be able to scale this. As well as I mentioned earlier, the continuous improvement around capacity building. We know there's tens of thousands of spinners and mills out there. So how can we start bringing them on the journey, even if an in-person assessment hasn't occurred yet? So that there really needs to be a lot of education around due diligence, and each tier of the supply chain having responsibility for risk of forced labor, in their within their own supply chain. I mentioned integrity before, the governance structure, that's another question. Is that what the industry wants, or are there ways to, again, leverage some of the existing structures out there? And of course, the revenue structure, so how to create this, that it's sustainable, that we have the necessary revenue to offer the type of capacity buildings and trainings that need to occur. And again, taking advantage of different efficiencies and technology. I think there's both the opportunity to use existing back-end platforms and e-learning platforms, as well as we know that there's a lot of technology tools coming into existence or already existing, around various traceability, DNA, fingerprinting, or isotopes, et cetera. So how could those types of efforts be coordinated with YESS? So what Liz and I have really been focused on getting the pilot off the ground, confirming those pilot companies. I think we've mentioned in the past that Nike, Circular Systems from a recycled content perspective, as well as Walmart, are all confirmed and participating in the pilot. There's two more companies, large retailers that we're talking to that are still in the process of kind of confirming 100%. I'm not going to name them exactly yet, but they're getting close. And as well as there's a couple of companies that have stepped forth, they're supporting at that ambassador level. VF and JCPenney, as well as New Balance, have all confirmed, and we're hoping that more will come forth. So we are looking to put out a press release where we will be naming all the companies. That would likely be early March. We're looking for commitments to the ambassador level by the end of this month, by the end of February, so that we could put out that press release in March, as well as get started with really starting to pull together the implementation working group. And we are looking for those that are participating to really step up if they have expertise in certain areas, or a lot of connections with other initiatives, et cetera, to help us kind of help lead that in the industry, because we know that it's going to have the most opportunity for success if those that are going to be interacting with this type of system and due diligence approach are part of creating the most efficient way to integrate this. as I mentioned, we'll be having quarterly update calls that will be open to all the sponsors at all levels, as well as really refining a 3 to 5 year business plan for the whole system and approach.